This video is brought to you by Policy Genius. If you have family members who depend on your income, you need life insurance. That's where Policy Genius comes in. More about them in just a bit. Nearly 3,000 years ago, a religious ritual rose up in the ancient world that would transform our relationship with sport. At a cult site dedicated to the god Zeus, a quadrennial event was instigated, one that would be held on the first full moon every fourth summer solstice for nearly 1,200 years. At their height, these games would attract so many people that entire wars had to be paused so that everyone could attend. Known as the Olympic Games, they were named after the site itself, Olympia, home to one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The forerunner of today's Olympics, the Games were one of ancient Greece's greatest spectacles. In the burning summer heat, athletes took part in brutal physical challenges in the hopes of winning glory. But this was more than a mere sporting event. So important were the Games to Greeks that they became everything from a prize to win in wartime to a way to measure the passage of time itself. 16 kilometers inland from the Ionian Sea, at a confluence of rivers, sits one of the most storied sites in history. While today little more than a collection of ruined pillars, this site was once the beating heart of an ancient cult. A cult with a ritual so long-lasting, so profound, it still shapes the way we perceive sport today. It was here, among these olive groves, that the forerunner of the modern Olympics was born. Although it would be thanks to ripped ancient dudes getting all sweaty that Olympia became famous, sport was far from the site's sole focus. Originally inhabited sometime before 1600 BC, Olympia quickly evolved into a place of religious worship, first for the god Kronos, then for others like Gaia and Aphrodite. But it would be the big granddaddy of them all who eventually triumphed. The transformation of the site into a place for worshipping Zeus came hot on the heels of the arrival of the Western Greeks, and we mean transformed. In the 5th century BC, a gigantic temple was built to honor the king of gods, one so vast it dwarfed every other temple in Greece. But it was what was inside that really blew the ancient world's collective mind. Standing at 12 meters tall, made from a combination of ivory and gold layered over a wooden core, the statue of Zeus was a wonder to behold. Like, literally. When Philo of Byzantium sat down to write his list of 7 wonders of the world, the statue of Zeus at Olympia would sit alongside the Great Pyramid at Giza. Not that the statue was the only pretty wondrous thing there. There was also a temple dedicated to Zeus's wife Hera, who was also his sister, because the ancient world was just gross like that. There was also a grand priest's residence, public baths and swimming pool, and guest houses for wealthy worshippers. All of which begs the question, if this was such a holy site, how come everyone was cool with naked guys going there to race and throw javelins? The answer lies in the very different way ancient Greeks viewed sport. While today rocking up to the Sistine Chapel all oiled up for some naked wrestling would be gloriously offensive, in the era we're talking about, sport and religion often went hand in hand. This was particularly true for funerary rites. As far back as the pages of the Iliad, we can find examples of funerals being celebrated with sporting events. So the idea of physical competition being combined with religious rite wasn't exactly alien to the Greeks. And given how much they were into fitness, it was probably only a matter of time before someone came up with the Olympic Games. Interestingly, we have no idea who that someone was. Tradition held that the Games were founded by Hercules or Zeus or some other non-historical figure, which doesn't help us very much. All we know is in the summer of 776 BC, the first recorded games were held at Olympia. There was only a single event, the Stadion foot race, equivalent to around 192 meters. It was won by Coroebus of Elis, a cook and baker who received only a single olive branch for his effort. Yet, it hardly mattered. With his literally historic win, Coroebus ushered in a new era in sporting history. Olympic Games would now be held every 4 years, so far as we can tell, without a break, for the next 1,200 years. So, here's the thing about games held at Olympia. They were far from unique. Just as the modern sporting calendar is filled with athletic events on years without the Olympics, so too did the ancients have other tournaments. Most significant were those at the Isthmus of Corinth, Delphi, and Nemea, which took place on non-Olympic years. Together, they were known as the Pan-Hellenic Games. So why then do we specifically remember the Olympics? Why don't we today hold the modern Nemean Games? Long story short, Olympia got there first. Since they were the first games established, the Olympics retained a prestige those at Delphi, Corinth, and Nemea could never match. In fact, they were so prestigious that they became a handy way of measuring time. An Olympiad was the 4-year cycle between games, and some ancient chronologies use it as freely as we might use a year or decade. Not that the games, despite their long time-marking existence, always looked the same. As we mentioned in the last chapter, the first Olympics in history had a single event, a foot race known as the Stadion. It wasn't until 13 more had taken place, spanning 52 years, that 2 new events were added, a roughly 400-meter race and another longer one. But that opened the floodgates, right? Surely those new events signaled the dawn of a modern-style sporting event. Well, yes and no. Yes, more events would be added, but no, it absolutely wouldn't be a flood. After the 400-meter dialos and longer Dolichos race joined the lineup, it would be 4 more Olympics, or 16 years, before the pentathlon was added in 708 BC. Since the pentathlon included racing, javelin, long jump, wrestling, and discus, it certainly made it seem like there were now many events, but it would actually be another 20 years before boxing officially became event number 5. After that came chariot racing, and so on until finally, now well over a century after their founding, the Games at Olympia had grown to 18 events. By this time, they'd become a focal point of the Hellenistic world. In the 5th century BC, the Games were so big that people traveled from all across the Mediterranean to take part. This included from city-states in North Africa or modern Spain, or up in the Black Sea. Since some of these journeys took so long, they gave rise to perhaps the Olympics' greatest achievement, the ability to stop war. For 3 months around each Games, a pan-Hellenic truce was called to allow the 40,000 spectators to attend. That meant every 4 years, people would put down their spears, pick up their bags, and peacefully make their way to Olympia for 5 days of celebration. Incredibly, it seems the truce nearly always held, although there were exceptions. Perhaps the biggest came in 364 BC, when a battle between the Eleans, who ran the Games, and their rivals spilled over into the stadium itself, supposedly while the pentathlon was underway. Since their enemies won the battle and thus control of the Olympics, the Eleans later struck the 364 Games from the official record. Most years, though, it was peaceful, and with that in mind, it's time for us to pause our general overview and zoom in on the event itself. Let us imagine what it would be like visiting Olympia in the ancient world. It's time for us to see what life was really like at the original Olympic Games. When talking about any sporting event, there are obviously 2 perspectives to consider, that of the spectators and that of the participants themselves. We're going to start with the latter. What were the ancient Olympics like for the men who actually competed? The use of that masculine word, by the way, was entirely intentional. If you were participating in the original Olympics, you had to be male. Although women had their own events known as the Heraia, the main Olympics was reserved for dudes with dongs. Aside from their chromosomes, though, these men had little in common. While there's a stereotype that the ancient games were for the Greek elite, that was probably no longer true by the 6th century BC. With public gymnasiums cropping up and wealthy patrons looking for talented athletes to back, competitors could come from all walks of life. When patrons weren't available, whole towns would sometimes club together to send competitors, so great was the prestige of winning. But to even get a chance at winning their event, the lucky athletes would have to survive the pre-games. I say lucky like that because the Olympic pre-games should probably be known as the Olympic Hunger Games. Lasting 30 days before the main event, the pre-games were mandatory and were designed to crush up and spit out any wannabes. Competitors were forced onto strict diets made to forego all pleasures, including sex, and train hardcore as possible with all of their rivals under the murderous Greek sun. And sometimes murder, or at least manslaughter, really was the outcome. There are coaches on record who straight up trained their athletes to death. The end result was a group of competitors and coaches so tough that the spectators were certain to get an entertaining Olympics. But just to make sure the events were fair, Elean judges were on hand to put cheats in their place. Prior to the competition, all athletes, plus their coaches and fathers, vowed before a statue of Zeus to play fair. After that vow was taken, anyone who stepped out of line could be beaten with a whip, even if their crime was just an accidental false start. For serious cheats, though, things were even worse. Rather than a whipping, these ancient Justin Gatlins had their names carved into a set of statues, so they would live on forever in infamy as a cheating douche. Still, at least their names did go down in history. Unlike the modern games, the ancient Olympics lived by the logic of second place is first loser. If you wanted to be remembered, you better come first, otherwise you just might as well never show up. Perhaps it's no wonder so many were tempted to cheat. With the pre-games out of the way and vows taken not to do a Lance Armstrong, the men would assemble in the apoditarium. Here they'd strip naked, common for exercising in the era, and rub their bodies with a mixture of oil and dust. Known as gloios, this gunk could be scraped from a winner's chiseled torso and sold for exorbitant prices to people who considered it liquid manliness. Yes, really. But that was only once they'd actually won. All naked and oiled up, the competitors would finally take their seats in a tunnel, waiting to be called up for their shot at immortality. Outside, tens of thousands would be cheering impatient for the next great event, for the next champion to earn his crown of olive leaves. Finally, a voice would ring out, calling their name. One by one, they'd stand, stride out into the tunnel, into the blazing sunlight, and the games would begin. Now, if you're looking to begin a new life insurance policy, then it might be a great time to connect with our friends over at Policy Genius. That was a transition. Look, nobody likes talking about life insurance, but the reality is that it's an important layer of protection for many families, especially for single-income households. Fortunately, there's Policy Genius and their award-winning policy options ranked number 1 by Forbes. Whether you've been putting off your purchase or you just never really thought about it, Policy Genius is the team you want to check in with. This is a third-party marketplace that works for you, not the insurance companies, so you can be sure that their licensed experts are going to give you solid, unbiased advice. Life insurance premiums might seem like a financial drain, but you could save more than $1,300 per year or more by using Policy Genius to compare life insurance policies. If you're interested, head to policygenius.com to get started. In just a few minutes, you can work out how much coverage you need and compare personalized quotes to find your best price. And when you're ready to apply, the Policy Genius team will handle the paperwork and scheduling for free. You could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius, and getting covered now locks in your rate. Over the course of a 10 or 20-year policy, those savings really add up. And best of all, eligible applicants can get covered in as little as 1 week. So head to policygenius.com/geographics to get started. You will be glad you did, because when it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right. And let's get back to the Olympics. While the ancient Olympics were a month and spare change of agony for the competitors, for those in the crowd, it was more like a giant party. Most of those attending would have traveled hundreds of kilometers to be there, journeys that were likely adventures in and of themselves. Once they'd arrived, the vast majority slept either under simple canvas or under the stars, something that doubtless added to the festival vibes. At least it did for those who were allowed to attend. In a classic piece of ancient dickery, married women were barred from the festival, leaving their husbands and a whole bunch of single ladies to have fun together. And the original games really could be fun. Unlike its modern counterpart, the biggest day in the ancient Olympic calendar didn't involve the opening or closing ceremonies, although those did exist. During its heyday in the 4th century BC, the first day would have formal oath-taking and musical competitions, while the final day saw a grand victory parade for all the winners. However, it was day 3 in the classic version that really stood out. Timed to coincide with the full moon, the day held no sporting events. Instead, 100 oxen would be sacrificed to Zeus, followed by a gigantic feast that everyone took part in. Since the sacrifices were always made in the same place, by the 2nd century AD, a 7-meter mountain of ash had grown up, around which people would take part in religious rituals. Compared to this blowout feast, the sports themselves were really just a sideshow, with equestrian sports and the pentathlon filling out day 2 and racing and combat sports occupying day 4. But then, that was what the games were back then, a religious rite that just happened to involve some athletics. That said, it was from the sporting days that the memorable anecdotes tended to come. The most memorable of all was likely the pancration match in 564 BC. Effectively a licensed beatdown, a pancration was a sort of ancient MMA with far fewer rules and far more brutality, with that year setting a particularly gruesome record. In the middle of his match, Erychion of Igalia found himself trapped in a stranglehold. Knowing that there was no way to both win and survive, the undefeated Archeon opted for the former. Pivoting his body, he was able to snap his opponent's ankle, or toe in some versions, at the cost of his own throat being crushed. But since his opponent tapped out through pain first, Archeon's corpse was later declared the winner. Even more gruesome was the boxing match between Damaxinos and Krugas, which ended when Damaxinos allegedly punched Krugas so hard with his fingers blade that he disemboweled him. But perhaps the best Olympic story belongs to Theagenes. The boxing winner at the 75th Olympiad, Theagenes was known for making enemies. One such such enemy was a guy who'd never won a single fight against him. When a bronze statue of Theogenes was put up in his hometown after it died, this same guy would go there every night to punch the statue. He kept this up until one night he punched the statue so hard that it came loose and toppled over, crushing him to death. Supposedly, the guy's sons then demanded that the statue be put on trial for murdering their dumbass father. Crazy as this is, though, the maddest stories of all don't come from the Hellenistic era. Oh no, they come from when the big boys of the ancient world took over the site and added Olympia to their own portfolio. We're talking, of course, about the Romans. Given the Games were a religious festival that didn't honor the gods, you might expect to hear that the Romans cancelled the Games faster than an outraged Twitter mob. But this wasn't the case. When Rome conquered Greece in the mid-2nd century BC, the Games were at such a level of prestige that it was seen as an honor to keep them running. Heck, in 80 BC, Sulla even tried to have them move to Rome itself. While his attempt failed, he certainly wasn't the last Roman to interfere. Far stranger was Caligula's plan to steal the statue of Zeus. According to Suetonius, the heist only failed when the statue gave a mysterious laugh which caused the scaffolding to collapse and kill Caligula's workers. But the gold medal for Olympic interference has to go to the only emperor who could out-crazy Caligula, Nero. In 67 AD, Nero decided to enter the Games as an athlete. Sources differ on what came next, but they basically boil down to Nero doing stupid-ass stuff like falling from his chariot during the race and still being declared the winner. Basically, it was the ancient equivalent of that time Kim Jong-il played golf and allegedly got 11 holes in one. But not even a pudgy toga-wearing lunatic hijacking the show could dent the ancient Olympic Games. By now in existence for nearly 800 years, the Games at Olympia had grown to become one of the Roman world's obsessions. While the official prize remained as simple as it had ever been, garland or laurel of olive leaves plucked from the sacred grove, the unofficial rewards just kept getting bigger and bigger. Because winning was so prestigious for your hometown, successful athletes might be handed anything from a lifelong pension to exemption from paying taxes to a plum job working for the state. And that was just in the public sector. Former winners could also make insane sums competing in other athletic events. We know of one Olympian in Asia Minor who charged 30,000 drachmas for this. By contrast, a Roman soldier at the time earned 1% of this sum in an entire year. Still, big as they were, the Olympic Games weren't the only games in town, or even at Olympia. Every 4 years, probably around the same time as the main games, the Heraia was organized, a stadion-like running event for unmarried women. Meanwhile, at the other locations of the Pan-Hellenic Games, equally unique events were emerging. The Pythian Games at Delphi, for example, included music and dance competitions that were probably closer to American Idol than any modern sporting event. For anyone alive in this era, then, the Games in general, and especially the ones at Olympia, probably seemed eternal. They'd now lasted a millennium. That's 10 times longer than our modern Olympics, and around 4 times longer than the USA has been in existence. As far as anyone could tell, they'd still be around after another 1,000 years had gone by. But that, sadly, was just an illusion. The ancient Olympics might have survived conquest, war, and the ravages of time, but it was about to meet one opponent that it stood no chance against. And the name of that opponent? Christianity. The speed at which Christianity not only took over the Roman Empire but closed down the Olympics was staggering. Christianity was made the official religion of Rome in 323 AD. By 393, the Christian Emperor Theodosius I had issued a decree banning all cults and pagan festivals. Among these, he included the Games at Olympia. After 293 Olympiads covering nearly 1,200 years of history, the Games were suddenly no more. It was a death blow from which the site itself would never recover. 2 years after Theodosius' decree killed the Games, another decree saw the statue of Zeus removed from its temple and taken to Constantinople, now capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. There it stood until it was finally destroyed in a catastrophe, a tsunami in some tellings, an earthquake or fire in others, around the 5th century. It was the third of the 7 classical wonders to be lost. Olympia itself didn't fare much better. In 426 AD, a whole different emperor named Theodosius also issued an anti-pagan decree. This led to the surviving monuments at Olympia getting smashed up and desecrated. Then, in the 6th century, 2 earthquakes hit the site, wiping out everything still standing. After that, it was left to silt from the river Alpheus to bury these scarred and broken remnants until they were just lost to time. It was a sad, abrupt end for such a storied place, a tragic whimper on which to close so many centuries of sporting history. But of course, it wasn't really the end. In 1829, the buried remains of Olympia were rediscovered by French archaeologists. Decades later, in 1875, the first serious excavations took place, leading to the mostly recovered site that we can see today. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Olympia would come from a visit undertaken by one man. Baron Pierre de Coubertin was a French dude obsessed with both physical fitness and ancient history. After visiting the partially excavated remains of Olympia, he was inspired to throw a new tournament in its honor, one which would bridge the 1,503 years since the first Theodosius shut them down. Taking place in Athens in 1896, de Coubertin's revival saw 13 nations come together to compete for the first time. 4 years later, 28 nations took part in the second edition. Today, of course, these modern Olympics are a huge part of the global sporting calendar, with over 200 nations and territories taking part and over 3.6 billion people worldwide tuning in to watch. Yet, as grand a spectacle as today's games are, they're still only a shadow of the original. Nearly 3,000 years ago, a single foot race near a sacred olive grove in the Peloponnese gave birth to a competition that would last more than millennia, one that was so prestigious it could stop wars. Just think about that for a second. How improbable that sounds. And yet, as we can see from historical records, it really happened. The ancient site of Olympia may be best known today for inspiring modern athletics, but even without this extra context, it was a powerful, important site, one that set the tone for much of the ancient world. It may have been abandoned over 1,600 years ago, but there's no doubt that Olympia will keep inspiring humanity for millennia more. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe and also check out our fantastic sponsor, Policy Genius, link below. And thank you for watching.